Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new format, Political Economy, of our new digital TV channel, Forbes 15. My name is Niklas Hintermeyer. I'm a journalist of the German-speaking issue of Forbes, and I'm very pleased to welcome and announce my guest today. He's the publisher editor of the German weekly newspaper, Zeit, Josef Joffe. Thank you for your time and your willingness to give us answers to our interview question, Mr. Joffe. I would like to start with a quote, because you wrote like in an article at the beginning of April in Die Zeit, where you said, "Corona threatens the world and unites it. That is the good news in bad times." In which sense did you mean that coronavirus is connecting and uniting the world? Because you could also argue that solidarity between states is falling apart.
Well, the most visible erosion has to do with Schengen land, meaning that borders are going up everywhere and likely to stay up for a while. That said, Europe is not disintegrating any further than it has always been. We forget that Europe is not a state, a nation state, not even for a federation, but the collection of 27 individual members. Corona is bad in as much as in emergencies, electorates look to their own nations, their own nation states, and their own capitals. This is where their loyalty belongs. This is the place from which they're getting help and support. But otherwise, the most important thing, which if we transcend Europe, is that the global threat has had a number of good effects. A, we cooperate. B, we compare and contrast what's working elsewhere. C, we are sharing research and inventions in the battle against Corona, and we can do so, unlike in previous pandemics, starting with the medieval Black Plague. It works in real time. These informations, and experiences and solutions travel around the world in real time. So that's the good part of Corona, if you wish.
You mentioned like European integration or disintegration. That's the question, because I want to mention some different areas of tension. Like on the one hand, France, Spain, and Italy is pushing forward for introduction of Corona bonds. In the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria are opposing this project and this program. Like on the other hand, there are more than a dozen member states that are criticizing Hungary for the introduction of this state of emergency law that Viktor Orban, the prime minister, can rule by decree. Don't we really see at least a tiny bit of a disintegration phase because of this lack of solidarity in some sense?
Look, we have to make a distinction. The battle over the euro is as old as the euro itself, which kicked in 1999. And certainly became dramatic in the 2008 Great Recession, when the Germans at least pretended or tried to impose fiscal discipline on what we call Club Med, or if you don't like that, we call it the Olive Belt. So that's not a new story. The new story, again, it has very little to do with Corona, because that trend began 10 years ago, is Hungary, Poland, or the neo-authoritarians in the new democracies. That was not caused by Corona. That has been the trend towards one-party rule has been around for at least a decade. What Corona has done is to give somebody like Viktor Orban a good pretext to dismiss parliament and to rule by decree. But let's not forget that parliament had been emasculated long before. So we have to make a distinction between cause and pretext. The cause of neo-authoritarianism is not Corona, but in case of Hungary, it makes for a good pretext.
Mm-hmm. Let's stay in Europe and let's talk about the economic recession in Europe. The EU has proposed or introduced this Corona package of 540 billion euros with the credit lines. Among them are the credit lines of the ESM and the corporate loans from the European Investment Bank. And experts say it's enough for a stop break, so to say, as an immediate measure to reduce this economic pressure in Europe. But like in the long term, other measures would be needed to finance a European recovery out of this crisis. What's your say on that? What's your opinion, and what has to be done in the long term?
Again, we got to make, in good academic fashion, we have to make distinctions. First of all, and most important, we don't want to repeat the Great Depression, when governments deflated, cut budget deficits, and then raised the customs barriers, which accelerated the crisis into a depression. So what we are doing now is not rocket science. I think it's just, there's no choice but to infuse purchasing power and certain, or at least monies, into the economy, into the economies. Again, let me go back now to the difference between Corona and what preceded it. The problem of European slow growth or no growth, again, way precedes Corona. And depending on who you are, whether you are a free marketeer or a Keynesian, if you are a free marketeer, I would say that the problem is that we haven't liberalized enough. We haven't made sure that competitiveness would increase. We have neglected very painful domestic reforms. I mean, just look at Macron in France, how hard he has to fight to even go to some modest reforms like pension reforms. So that has, again, nothing to do with Corona. It's a disease, so to speak, we've carried forward in the past. Obviously, when the crisis is over, we don't know when, we should go back to the program, which is make sure we have more internal liberalization, we have more competitiveness. But that requires, and I'll end on that one, enormous political capital to overcome, entrenched interests and privileged groups at home, as Monsieur Macron is demonstrating on a daily level.
There were controversies also, like in Germany, because the Federal Constitutional Court has ruled that the purchase of government bonds is partially a breach of the German constitution. Like on the other hand, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that the European Court of Justice has the last say, so to say, on judgments in regard to the European Union, and it's binding on national courts. When we talk now about the pandemic emergency purchase program by the ECB, that was introduced to purchase government bonds in these times, is this under threat, do you think?
Well, again, let's look at what's on the surface and what's below the surface. On the surface, the Germans and the members of what I call the former Deutschmark zone, before we had the euro, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Scandinavians, etc., have always been very vigilant about the ECB, the European Bank, subverting the spirit and the letter of the Maastricht treaties, which said, one, no bailout, B, you cannot use monetary policy to conduct fiscal policy, which is to use these monies to allow nations like Club Med to finance growing budget deficits. So that's the surface, so to speak. If you go back to the great 2008 crisis, when ever since the Germans have been yelling about no bailout. Yet in the end, the Germans paid up and they contributed to one rescue mechanism after the other. That's point one. Point two, the verdict of the Constitutional Court, I don't think is that dramatic. Why? It has not invalidated all these other infusions of billions or the rescue mechanisms, which were all, though not formally, mechanisms that share the debt, which the Germans hate like the devil. What do I conclude from that? The Germans will always grumble and yell, but they will pay. Why? Because they have been among the greatest profiteers of European integration and monetary integration. One last point for the jurists among us. What the court has said, look, never mind what happened in the past, that's okay with us. But just be a bit more careful, please. Don't be quite so gung-ho. And now we get to the philosophical point is, they say, and I agree with that, by the way, that we don't have a European state, we don't have a European nation, we're not even a federation like the United States. We are, in the end, an assembly of 27 nation states. So we cannot yield our hegemony, so to speak, over the Constitution to somebody else. As long as we are a bunch of nation states, the Constitution is interpreted, must be interpreted at home. So to finish on this one, there is theoretically a really interesting conflict brewing here, which goes back, if you go to the United States, in its early days, there was always the same kind of tension between national institutions and states' rights. Knowing the way Europe works and the Germans work, I think we'll continue to fudge it. This is not going to turn into something like the American Civil War, where a bunch of states said, no, we will not obey the federal institutions, in this case, the European institutions.
That's a good transition to my next question, to talk about the European Union as a project as a whole, because you wrote at the beginning of February, also in the Zeit, article, that in order to gain more weight on the world stage, the European Union should push forward power politics. And you said, like, within this framework, Germany would play a very important role. But do you
That's
think?
not what I said, but I think that's what everybody pretends to say. Look, everybody always says, we look to Germany, we look to Mrs. Merkel, she's the uncrowned empress of Europe and all that kind of thing. When it comes to the nitty-gritty and to the crunch, they will not knuckle under Germany. Certainly not the French and the others. That's one part of the problem. The other part is that I don't think the Germans, as powerful and big and rich as they are emotionally and mentally ready to really play out, go for hegemony, so to speak, or primacy. It's not part of the German DNA after 1945. They tried twice in the 20th century, to reach for hegemony over Europe. They failed more miserably each time. And so there is the sense of mission that, that the French have, or the Brits or the Americans, is not given to the Germans given their historical experience. And somehow it's very hard to imagine somebody like Mrs. Merkel to be the leader of Europe. I mean, she is not even a very, very powerful leader of Europe, but always kind of maneuvering, going, changing course by a couple of degrees left or right, but never, trying to imitate Charles de Gaulle, for instance.
But would Europe need someone like Charles de Gaulle to stay within this comparison?
If it were, well, I think, if it were like the United States, which has a common constitution, a common sense of nationhood, and which in the beginning, when, let's say, when it wrote its constitution, made sure that it would have a strong executive. The executive was tested, like in the Civil War. It took 600,000 dead in that war, the worst war in American history, to assert the power of the center of the nation. But we are not going to have a war in Europe to copy them. And I have to repeat myself, we are not a nation state. We are not even a federation. So sovereignty remains lodged in the 27 members. And it's very hard for me to imagine that somehow, the French, the Italians, the Portuguese will yield it to anybody, let alone the Germans. So Europe, I think, constitutionally and emotionally, so to speak, is not ready to take on a global role. And as we see, Europe is not. And I don't know what it would take to overcome the basic flaw in the arrangement. It's a collection of nation states, but not a United States of Europe.
And let's talk about the United States, because at the moment, the United States are struggling with very high unemployment rates, soaring budget deficit, death toll because of the coronavirus crisis. Like also US President Donald Trump cuts a poor figure sometimes with very controversial statements. How do you think will the US election campaign continue or start off like in the upcoming weeks and months?
Well, I've been wrong so often on my bets on electoral outcomes that I won't make that mistake again. I think one can describe the issues. Trump is everything you say, and putting on a fearful show. We don't have to go into the rhetoric. We are familiar with it, but I don't see how Biden, the presumptive nominee, is doing any better, sitting there in his basement and hardly appearing before the public eye. Plus, he is suffering from age, 77 years old. Sometimes he rambles on. He does not seem to be always on top of what he wants to say. So to put all this in terms of numbers, if I look at the opinion figures, approval rates just take whom are you going to vote for, which is these numbers are kind of come out every few days. And what I see is that the gap between Biden and Trump is not moving. Biden, since the beginning of the year, has been ahead 4 or 5 points. It's not moving. You would think that given the performance, to come back to your question, of Trump plus the state of the economy, you would think that the opposition leader, Biden, would be soaring in the polls. He is not. His 4 points or so are within the margin of error. So I am not betting on the next president by the name of Joe Biden. Also, we never know. In the middle of the summer, he might fall sick and drop out of the race. Who the hell knows when you're 77? But I would be very cautious to predict the ejection of Trump from the White House in November.
Let's see how it goes then. Let's talk about NATO, because there were many talks and also controversies whether the United States, within the framework of NATO, should still remain the prime guarantee for territorial defense of Europe. That's also the reason why politicians like Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is pushing strongly forward for the introduction, the creation of an own European army. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, she's also not reluctant to this idea. But do you really think that the United States is moving away from Europe in defense matters? Because, for example, there was this Defender Europe military that was cancelled
because of Corona.
Was cancelled, but the deployment would have been the biggest from US troops within years, as Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, so to say, said. And also, there are still, for example, troops from the United States in Poland to deter Russian aggression. So my question is, the United States really moving away in defense matters from Europe?
Yeah, that I can pretty clearly deny by looking at the facts. I'm not looking at the rhetoric of Mr. Trump, with NATO being obsolete and pay up or we'll pull out. I'm looking at the facts, and the facts are, under Trump, the American military presence in Europe has risen from about 5,000 or so, which Obama had cut to the bones, by the way. That's point one. Point two, the United States has moved troops forward to the eastern border. That's the basics of extended deterrence. You signal to the Russians, if you attack Poland or what have you, you'll have to attack the United States. And third, we already mentioned that a nation that's about to withdraw from European defense does not get involved in these gigantic maneuvers like Defender, what was last year's called, I forget, that brought 20,000 American troops to the continent to demonstrate the ability to deploy and reinforce quickly. So if I look at what he does rather than what he says, I don't think that Trump is even in his nightmares dreaming of abandoning Europe. It's not in the American interest to leave, 500 million people with the second largest economy in the world to the mercy of Russia. In that respect, the logic that obtained for the past 70 years still obtains now.
Also, Brexit wasn't really like in the media like the last couple of weeks because of this coronavirus crisis. More Boris Johnson itself.
What is Brexit? What is it?
That's a question. We have to.
Anything happening?
Yeah, we have to talk about it again now. But because talks about bilateral free trade agreement between the United States and the UK have begun. And my question would be, could this be like a revival of this special relationship that has begun after the Second World War? And could it be also like a first political positioning of the UK after Brexit? Because the UK always talked about Boris Johnson, the new global Britain. Could this be like the first sign, like a first demonstration?
This special relationship, if I may delve into history for a moment, has always been more of a myth than a reality. It worked twice, World War I, World War II, but remember it took the US until 1917 to get into the act and to save Britain and Europe. It took the United States until 42, so to speak, to finally come in on the side of Europe and Britain by entering into World War II. So the special relationship obtained in these two cases, but it took a while before it kicked in. Since World War II, I can cite a number of cases where the special relationship was not too impressive. The most dramatic case is the Suez War in '56, when the United States used the obvious weakness of Britain to kick the Brits and the French out of the Middle East. Not a friendly act. And most recently, do you remember how we were supposed to bomb Syria in 2015, I think, because of the chemical weapons? What happened is that the Brits said, no, we're not going to participate, and neither did Obama. So these are just some examples where the special relationship has not worked or not worked very well. Coming to your question about the economy, I just don't know, frankly, how you can exchange, a European market, which, including the Brits, had 500 million people, and as I said before, the second largest economy in the world. We always forget that China is not number two. Europe is number two. How you can exchange that, where you were part of the system and you had a say, with, for the United States, huge market, of course, largest economy, but where you have no say over decision making, where you are a nation of 60 million up against a nation of 330. So the power relationship is so unbalanced that I suspect that the Brits will not live happily ever after in the embrace of the United States, especially since the United States, and that's not just Trump, I think, is tightening up. It's closing in on itself. It is no longer as interested as it was in the past half century in multilateralism and free trade. So the upshot is, if I were Britain, I wouldn't put too much store in this kind of transatlantic, wonderful new world with the US, Britain, Canada, maybe bring in Australia, whatever, the Anglosphere. I wouldn't make too big a bet on this. So I don't know. I don't want to be the Prime Minister of Britain right now.
Yeah, that's a tough job. I'd say it's a pretty tough job. Maybe as a last question, because unfortunately we're running out of time a bit, like a switch of topics, talking about media, of course, in the Zeit, with the coronavirus crisis, because of the coronavirus crisis, media working more and more, moving more and more into digital sphere, also interviews taking place on Zoom, screened on YouTube, etc., etc. How do you think the media is going to transform also because of this coronavirus crisis? And what did you do at your newspaper, Die Zeit, to change processes or structures in the recent weeks?
For the time being, we're all sitting in the same boat, like me here or you there. What are we doing? We're talking to each other by Zoom. We are running our meetings, our editorial meetings by Zoom. The meeting room table of the Zeit used to assemble 30 people or more, or 40 people doing meetings. Now there are 5 or 6 sitting there, and each of them maintaining the 2 meters, 6 foot. So, and that's true for all the papers in the world that I know. And it seems to be working. We are people like you and me are very privileged. We don't have to sit at the assembly line or at the cash register. How it will transform the media, again, it may just accelerate what's been happening anyway. If you look at the great Anglo papers, the Times, Guardian, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they have long ago abandoned what Marx would have called our traditional modes of production. They all have moved online. And the largest increases in circulation are coming online. There are no longer any newspapers as we know them. I mean, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal are not daily papers anymore. They are hourly papers. I no longer have any print deliveries in my house. Why would I want to read a paper that's 16, 18 hours old? So COVID is going to accelerate what's already been in the pipelines. As far as the rest is concerned, I think it's all for the good, if I may say so. I mean, we will spend less time in airports and planes. We'll do this, what we are doing right now. And it seems to be working, isn't it?
So far, yeah.
But again, I have to emphasize, we are being very privileged because we don't have to sit at cash registers or deliver the mail physically. But basic point again, Corona is not causing these things. They may be accelerating it, but what I've been talking about has been around for about 20 years now, that evolution we are talking about.
Josef,
but isn't it nice not to have to go to the airport?
Yeah, I mean, it makes some things easier, definitely, to have online meetings.
Teaching will change too.
Teaching will change, yeah. Maybe like a combination of online meetings and going to class physically, and like also for education, definitely. Yeah, we've seen it like in the recent month and weeks. On that note, thank you very much, Josef Joffe. It was a very interesting interview. I hope we can repeat that like in the future again. And I wish you all the best and see you soon.
I'm here. As we say, stay well.
Stay well.
Stay healthy.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.